Okay, I think be able to get started. So, wow, thank you everyone for coming this afternoon. We have over 100 participants already in the meeting. So I just want to say thank you so much for taking time out of your lunch and your afternoon to be here with us today. For today's webinar and transforming parking minimums. Our event will run for approximately 1 hour, and then it'll be followed by an open Q&A period as well. So I'd just like to start off by acknowledging that we are located and operate on the traditional territory of the Lekwungen speaking peoples, the Songhees and Esquimalt nations, who have a historical and ongoing relationship to the land where our offices and homes are located. We invite you to share the Indigenous territories you're joining from today. And if you're unsure of those host nations of your land, you can always visit native-land.ca to learn more about the North American indigenous nations across Turtle Island. I'm also joined today by my colleagues, Aja, Colton, Diana, and Michaela, who are integral in the creation of this event. So if you require tech support, please private message anyone with a star beside their name, and they'll be happy to help you. We also encourage you to rename yourself with your first name, preferred pronouns, and an organizational affiliation if applicable. We'll be managing the chat, so please try to keep engagement positive and solutions oriented. We'll be feeding comments from the chat to our speakers for our Q&A period as well. So feel free to ask them during our Zoom meeting as well. We may not get to them right away, but we'll make sure to have them in a document to get to our speakers. This webinar is also being hosted as part of RHAP, which is the Regional Household Affordability and Prosperity Project. It's going to be building on our project activities of reading and reviewing case studies and global best practices, compiling and sharing that information, and ultimately being able to engage with the community, like today, on a variety of issues linked to housing affordability within our region. So thank you to both UBCM and the City of Colwood. Just the next slide, Michaela. So a little bit about us and the Community Social Planning Council. The Community Social Planning Council provides reliable information and engagement processes that help inform decision-making across all sectors in order to support broad-based social well-being. Our values are the attainability of a healthy, sustainable, just, and vibrant community, that accurate and accessible information is a tool for positive social change, and that marginalized voices need to be part of the social planning process at all stages, and that there also is a great necessity of broad-based processes of reconciliation with Indigenous communities. So on the topic of today's webinar, we're going to be exploring the removal of mandatory parking requirements, which is a policy change that we have seen on the global stage in addressing both affordability and the climate crisis. Currently, there is a defined cultural shift in the way we navigate and interact with our cities. At a time, it would have been unfathomable for the average Canadian to commute to work, shuttle children to soccer practice, and run errands like grocery shopping and doctor's visits without a motor vehicle. Now, nearly 50% of residents within the city of Victoria commute by walking, cycling, or public transportation, with 22% of residents within the core municipalities between the ages of 18 and 34 not even owning a driver's license currently. So this idea of having these mandatory parking minimums originated in the mid-20th century, and there is zoning requirement that new developments must provide a certain amount of parking spaces according to the size of the development and or the number of dwelling units. And so for most developments, those must be included as a default. These parking minimums distance us from the places where we want to access, and they can create barriers within our communities, whether it be the grocery store, a clinic, or your local park. They create a physical barrier between where we are and the places we want to access. They excavate urban sprawl and limit development potential if market or site conditions don't necessarily lend themselves to accommodating personal vehicles. And why this comes up as an affordability measure is because adding parking practices that we currently have is like adding a 10 to 15% tax on developments. It's a financial burden that we can't afford, especially in a housing and affordability crisis, especially when some of the most vulnerable groups to housing shortages tend to own fewer or no vehicles in the first place. More than 200 communities across North America have now removed parking requirements in localized areas or citywide, and a growing number of cities are establishing car-free zones like Amsterdam, Paris, Barcelona, and even Tempe, Arizona. So signaling that the removal of parking minimums is becoming a less radical idea within the world of urbanism and city design. Our agenda for today will have 3 speakers, John J. Botters, Kim Petrin, and Brent Todderin today. And they're all going to be discussing different aspects of removal of parking minimums and city planning from their own perspectives. We're also going to be having a community response panel with Julian West and Virginia Holden. After that period, we are going to have a short amount of time, about 15 to 20 minutes, for some audience engagement to have an open QA and dialogue with our speakers as well. And so we'll just leave the room open for that in case some folks need to leave at the 1 p.m. cutoff. And without further ado, I would like to start off by introducing our first speaker of the afternoon, John J. Botters. John is the mayor of Emeryville, California, where he's resided since 2012. He's a former legal aid attorney who's represented victims of domestic violence, people experiencing homelessness, and tenants facing evictions. He's an animal lover, bicyclist, and outdoor enthusiast, and can be spotted on the Bay Trail or Emeryville Greenway. So without further ado, John.
Thanks, Gadoni, and thanks so much for inviting me to join in this panel and presentation today. My name is John Botters. I have the privilege of serving as Emeryville's mayor. As I like to say, the small but mighty city in the Bay Area. There's 101 cities in the Bay Area in California, and we are number 100th by size. We're just over 1 square land mile. So we get a lot done in a little space, and that's kind of the theme for the portion of the conversation that I'm going to lift up today. I just want to speak briefly to parking in our city, which we did back in 2019, 4 years ago, and where that fits into a greater suite of policies around sustainable land use development and design. So as a small city right in the heart of the Bay Area, we're located just at the eastern foot of the Bay Bridge. As recently as 20 years ago, there were only about 5,000 people who resided in Emeryville. And for the first 100 years of the city's existence, not more than about 2,500 people lived here. It was an industrial town that was used as a adjacent place to the Port of Oakland for industrial purposes, manufacturing, goods and freight movement, and other economic activities, but it was never really viewed as a residential space or as kind of a community space that people came to. It was kind of seen as like a forsaken place that people didn't go. Emeryville really reinvented itself starting about 30 years ago when industry kind of died out here in this east side of the Bay Area. And with it came the opportunity for the city to really turn into a urban thriving community that was livable, accessible, and gave people greater proximity to both job choices and transportation opportunities. And so I want to speak just a little bit to the precursors of Emeryville's elimination of parking minimums as to what things helped really create the community support for why we could eliminate parking minimums. One of the biggest things that happened in Emeryville was we created something called a parcel-based improvement district. We call it the Paved here in Emeryville. And with it, we fund a free transit service. So we're one of the few communities in the United States that has a completely free transit system. The Emery-Go-Round is the name of our transit system. It offers 3 routes around the city that run all day and on the weekends, and it connects people to the Amtrak, the regional rail, and the BART system, which is our public transit regional subway system. Riders can get on and off. There's no fee for riding the Emery-Go-Round, and the Emery-Go-Round is available to people by virtue of parcel owners paying into the district. We offer a second program called 8 to Go, which assists people who are seniors and people who live with disabilities. So any person over the age of 70 and any person between the ages of 18 and 69 who are eligible for any type of disability-based assistance federally or in California can have an on-demand shuttle service come pick them up at their location, take them anywhere in Emeryville or any part of the 94608 zip code, as well as to regional medical centers where they may need to get a doctor visit. We also have this free student transit pass program. So we partner with AC Transit and BART, and through the county and through a grant program, we offer free transit passes to all of our students who go to Emory Unified Schools. And so they can use those for after school programs to and from commuting to the school, as well as anything they want to do with their friends on the weekends. Why do I share all this? Well, what it did was it created a community where about 25 to 30% of our population commute and go about their daily life using something other than a car. And it led to a conversation about, well, why do we have parking minimums in the first place? So my narrative is about how transit, investing in transit and transit options and all ages and accessibilities, infrastructure and programming actually helps make the conversation easy. There was not opposition of any significant kind in Emeryville to eliminating parking minimums. When I introduced this request about 4 or 5 years ago, we had a discussion in Emeryville about what was the best use of space. We're literally located in the Bay Area and we wanted to produce housing. And in 2018, our voters overwhelmingly $50 million housing bond in a 1 square mile city for us to leverage state and federal funds to build more affordable housing for working people, because Emeryville has become a job center. There are about 1,200 businesses registered in Emeryville. And although about 14,000 people live here today, about 35,000 people come to Emeryville every day, either to work or shop. And so with that, we had the potential for a very strong traffic impact. And so we made all those transit system investments, but we said we want to incentivize further. We want the new housing opportunities and the new people who are coming in for jobs or in for housing into our city to feel that they can make a better social choice, a better environmental choice, and a better economic choice for themselves and their families. So we eliminated parking minimums, and this was in addition to several other parking policies we had already put in place. We had a parking overlay rule that said if you had a parcel that was within a quarter mile of a transit hub, you automatically had a 50% reduction on any parking maximums that would be allowed. So we were already hearing from developers, you have really low maximums because most of our city is within a transit hub. When you're a 1 square mile city, most of the city falls within a transit hub space. But what we basically did was we took the floor away and we said, you don't have to produce these parking spaces anymore. As I'm sure other people on this call will tell you, $40,000 to $65,000 a parking space is roughly the construction cost. And that often gets translated into rental costs for tenants who have bundled parking with their units. And we said, you don't have to do that. So now we have projects coming through in Emeryville. After you pass an ordinance, it takes some time to see what the impacts of that will be. Well, we have in the works. The first is 4300 San Pablo. We're using affordable housing funds to build about 65 units of housing. 80% of them will be for low-income seniors. 20% of them will be for young people who we call transition age youth, who are leaving foster care and have no family and have no longer eligible for state funding supports. That 65 unit building will have 20 or fewer spaces in it, in the construction of it. And what that did was it allowed us to take a small city owned parcel and maximize the number of housing units, including units that have space for a living caregiver, for a person who's a senior or a young person who creates a family, to have the maximum number of people in our city without dedicating so much space to parking. Similarly, we have another project that just got its funding goals completed and is going to be in construction this year at 3600 San Pablo. That will have just over 90 units of housing. About 30% of those units will be permanent supportive housing units for people who are coming out of homelessness. And in that situation, there's going to be just over 30 parking spaces for those 90 plus units. And with that, we're taking the additional floor space on the ground floor, and we're going to actually move a local nonprofit that provides food assistance service into the building with the space we saved by eliminating parking minimums. We have a large 12-story life sciences tower that's going to have 30 units, townhomes and apartments along the north side of it to integrate it into a residential neighborhood. It's going to jobs, and it has the ability to have, under the normal parking maximum rules, it could have as many as almost 800 parking spaces. It's in the transit hub overlay, so that reduced it to going to come in with just 300 parking spaces in that building, and they're going to rely on the integrated transit systems we've developed. So are willing to actually move requirement that they have minimums to begin with. The last thing I'll share on this space is that learned through this process as a city that's old and has a lot of really old industrial buildings is the need to reuse buildings. There's a lot of interest in preserving architectural history. Doing that, somebody has a really old brick building, it was a cannery perhaps some other use in the city, and how are they going to provide minimum parking? When you eliminate parking minimums, you've got folks who can actually come in to the building, repurpose that building for small business purposes, and not have to deliver any new parking to the community for a community-friendly, local-serving business instead. And we've seen businesses become more interested in taking some of our old industrial buildings, their uses without adding a single parking space. Vision for how it can be done, and I'm excited to hear from the others on the call today about what they're doing. But welcome everybody to Emeryville anytime you'd like to visit. Thanks.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that. And it was very insightful to hear about some of the things that are being done south of the border, and some things that maybe we can model in our cities here in Greater Victoria as well. To follow up to that will be a Canadian example. We're going to have our second speaker today, Kim Petrin. Kim is the branch manager for development services at the City of Edmonton. She's an energetic, creative, and hands-on professional with a passion for city building. And with 20 years in the public and private sector, Kim has led an impressive, growing body of transformative planning initiatives and practices. She believes in doing work that improves quality of life for Edmontonians by creating inclusive, well-designed, and thoughtful urban places. So without saying any more, Kim, please share with us.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I just want to note I'm sitting here in the City of Edmonton, which resides on Treaty 6 territory. Feel very honored and privileged to be able to work and build a great city for today and our future generations. So thank you so much for having me. So with that, we'll flip to the next slide and get started. Parking. Parking is a really exciting topic, lots of passion around this topic, and certainly a reflection that it's often a hidden but very powerful force in shaping how our communities are designed. How parking is supplied, how it's priced and used affects many aspects of how we live, how we work, how we move around our city. It's also an equity issue, as parking provisions can impact affordability and the way that you access space. So designing our city around parking amenities instead of people, which is what we really want to do, is design our cities for people, can result in wasted space and overlooked business opportunities. Really proud and excited to share with you here this afternoon the story of Edmonton. Edmonton made history in June of 2020 by becoming the first major Canadian municipality to eliminate on-site parking minimums in a citywide one step. So we refer to this as open option parking, which is really seeking to achieve the right amount of parking by enabling businesses or landowners to choose the amount of on-site parking they feel is needed, rather than trying to mandate a minimum amount of parking. This was a really transformational change for the City of Edmonton, as it reversed a decade of planning and development patterns that had mandated parking be developed. And as a result, change happens incrementally and over time, but it did come with a series of past bylaw changes and projects and studies that we did over the years. So I'll just walk you through a few slides here today to tell you more about that. Thank you. So like many North American cities in the 1960s, Edmonton introduced minimum number of parking spaces to be provided with your home or your business. And that was really based on the ability or the ability of each property to accommodate the highest parking need, known as peak demand. So for example, for those of you that have been to West Edmonton Mall, think of a mall. So peak demand is that week before and the week after Christmas. So you can imagine how much parking is not used for the most part of the year. And so these spaces just sit there empty. And in Edmonton in 1973, this study was completed and it identified and set these minimum parking requirements and relatively remained unchanged in Edmonton for over 30 years, despite our city doubling in size, the construction of our light rail transit system, and the shift in our policy aspirations as a city. Next slide, please. So this is our journey in dealing with parking. Decade, about 10 years, successively reducing and removing parking, minimum parking requirements. In some cases, they have been eliminated in our downtown, and we did a comprehensive parking study review that identified parking regulations do not reliably meet demand, resulting in an oversupply of parking citywide, which translates into how our city looks and how we are moving around our city. Next slide, please. So open option parking, as I noted, doesn't mean no parking. It means the right amount of parking. It's the middle ground between minimum and maximum parking requirements. So this is a market-based approach that helps to remove barriers to development by allowing choice and flexibility. And for this reason, it is more likely to result in the right amount of parking as businesses or landowners know their parking needs better than the city and have an interest in ensuring that they are met. I'll share a story of a supportive housing provider that was looking to develop, I think it was about 50 units for the homeless Indigenous community, for those that were not able to be housed in existing facilities. And really mindful of the permitting and appeal process. And so that particular developer or supportive housing owner didn't want to have any variances. So they provided the parking, and it resulted in $1 million parkade that sits empty today because people that are transitioning from houselessness don't have a car. But it's these cost impacts that create barriers for providing supportive and affordable housing in our city. Next slide, please. So demand for on-site parking boils down to mode choice. For any way you want to go, there's three main decision points of how much time is it going to take, how much is it going to cost, and how is it going to be to find a spot. And people balance these three factors every time they take a trip, considering where they're going and why they're going there. And they place a value on their time. And for a lot of people, a vehicle's cost or maintenance, wear and tear, insurance, etc., are not factored into the trip either. Instead, considerations such as price of gas, availability of parking at the destination, or whether the parking is free really influences whether or not one might drive. Additionally, demographic factors or business types and popularity of a specific location, all within a city, influence a parking demand. So I always think of my favorite coffee shop in a small community just south of the river in Edmonton. They have met their parking requirements, but only a few spots. But because it's so popular, there's a tremendous amount of people there that the parking doesn't even meet the demand of the business that's operating. So the city can't regulate many of these factors, and our technical study found that these are not significant predictors of demand. So therefore, is the zoning bylaw really the right tool to regulate parking? Next slide, please. So when we were looking at open option parking, we considered three options. All in, eliminate minimum parking requirements, phase it in over multiple years or in certain places, or I call the third option, kick it down the road. Do it when we're doing some other zoning work and think about how we might phase it in at that point. And the City of Edmonton, as I noted, proud to say we went all in, a one-step implementation approach to eliminating parking minimums. It was most consistent with the findings of our technical study. It removed barriers to development. It kept regulations simple. Everybody understood it. It was predictable. It resulted in time and cost savings, both of the developer or the investor, but also for administration in issuing permits. It provides choice and flexibility for homeowners, and it supports the gradual transition to a more compact urban environment. Next slide, please. With all three approaches, and I think this was a question I noticed in the chat when we were first getting started, there were a number of commonalities between all three approaches. We needed to make sure that there were parking spaces for use by persons with disabilities, and bicycle parking requirements needed to be maintained. Previously, those were tied to the number of parking stalls. So we created regulation to ensure that those were still going to be provided. Parking maximums will continue to be applied in key transit supportive areas to support that compact, walkable urban environment we see around key stations. And regulations including parking lot design, stall size, access, and landscaping will continue to be maintained as well. Next slide, please. With all of this change, which is quite transformational, it does come with some risk. Certainly we heard from Edmontonians the concern about parking, people parking on the street. But while parking management measures can influence behavior and manage congestion, the supply of on-street parking needs to be managed as a strategic public asset in support of these larger city building goals that we have. So with the approach to open option parking, a one step of reducing or eliminating, the parking minimums, Some new developments will undersupply parking. We haven't necessarily seen that yet, but I suspect it will happen. This currently happens under our existing regulations as well. So when areas experience these pinch points, the city currently has a number of curbside management tools that we can apply. And these include time-restricted parking, paid parking, a residential parking program, and of course, enforcement. So to ensure that alignment between our regulatory approach and on-street parking management, we developed a curbside management strategy. Next slide. So what does this all mean for the city of Edmonton or for other cities that are contemplating eliminating minimum parking requirements is that it's transformational. It comes with some risk, but it has the potential to deliver significant long-term benefits. It means improved choice and flexibility for Edmontonians. It supports cost savings and efficiencies for businesses because the rules and the process is simplified and predictable. And while the change is transformative, it will also be gradual. A market-based approach takes time, and it's only realized as sites are developed or redeveloped across the city in decades ahead. So this doesn't mean that no parking will be provided. Rather, developers will right-size the amount of parking based on their customer. An all-in approach of open option parking is one of the most influential changes the city can make towards achieving our goals, which is a compact, walkable, vibrant, urban, climate resilient city. And so we've had this implemented for about 2 years. And what's happened, if you're wondering what's happened in the 2 years that we've had these elimination of the parking minimums, we're still getting parking. Parking is still being developed. So that's the punchline there. But it's been right-sized for the development that's doing the work. We've seen developments share parking. We've seen parking spots convert to patios, which I think is really exciting. Our permitting process is easier, and we've been able to reduce red tape through this. Edmonton received top marks, actually. I'll share with you the Canadian Home Builder Association did a 2022 municipal benchmarking study, and it examined how local development processes, approvals, and changes affect housing affordability and housing supply in major markets across the country. Edmonton is number 1, and this reduction of or elimination of minimum parking minimums is just part of how Edmonton is really becoming a progressive city to become that vibrant, urban, climate resilient city that we envision. So thank you very much for having me here this afternoon, and look forward to the discussion.
Amazing. Thank you so much for all of those insights with a Canadian context as well, Kim. It's really interesting seeing how Edmonton's parking has shifted over the last decade, and I'm really excited to see kind of where it goes from there, closely following for sure. And last but not least on our speaking panel today is going to be Brent Toderen. Brent is a nationally and internationally respected practitioner and thought leader on cities and city building, with over 30 years of experience in advanced urbanism, city planning, urban design, transportation, and change management, land change management. Over the last 10 years since returning to consulting.
You don't have to read the rest of it. Stop,
You're
please.
good. All right, I'll let you go. I'll let you dive in. I know that you have a lot to say, Brent, so I don't want to take up any of your precious time.
Well, I just hate hearing that bio over. I think you took that from my website. That's the long version, for God's sakes. I'd like to, as I'm pulling up my my few slides here, I want to make a few introductory statements. I do work of all types all over the world, and I wasn't sure what I wanted to talk about because I've worked specifically with many cities on rethinking their parking. But I decided to focus on a client I've had for about 5 years, the city of Kingston, Ontario, because I consider Kingston and Victoria to be sort of brother or sister cities. They're very much alike. The only major difference is Victoria has nicer weather, which means you have one less excuse than Kingston has to rethink things like how you get around and where you park your car. Over the last couple of years, well, about a couple of years ago, I was asked by my clients, what would you do about parking? Because we were in the process of updating the new zoning bylaw. And they had spent about 5 years and at least 2 major consultant studies that cost many hundreds of thousands of dollars to give them advice on how to update their parking regulations. And I was asked what I thought about what their next steps should be. And I looked at everything, and my piece of advice to them was to throw it all out and start from scratch, because frankly, all the advice they were getting from the professional firms was just continuation of the wrong thing to do. Continuation of this feeling that we're still faking it with regard to our parking minimums, because one of the fundamental things we have to all understand about parking regulations is the emperor has never had any clothes. One thing we know for sure about parking minimums is there's very little, if any, science associated with them, very little, if any, real defendable analysis. And the one thing I say to all my clients is, I know your minimum parking requirements are wrong. I just don't know by how much and in what direction, but that gives me very little faith that there's any real solidity to them. So if we're going to accept that premise, where do we go from there? And over about a year and a half, we redid the entire parking process, including a fundamentally different conversation with the community about parking. And that's what I want to talk about with you today. I'm going to summarize. I'm not going to depend on my slides too much. I'm going to summarize what I have to say to you in 5 keys that I think are applicable to any city, and particularly small and mid-sized cities that are thinking about this. Because up till a relatively short time ago, parking revolution in terms of how we do our parking minimums was seen as a big city thing. Certainly when we went looking for how to do things differently in Kingston, we called the big cities that were doing it. We talked to Edmonton, we talked to Toronto, we talked to Vancouver, but I think Edmonton was the smallest city that we found that was actually doing this, and very few small and medium-sized cities were undertaking this challenge. So I think I want to boil this down to things that are specifically applicable to cities of the size of the people that may be listening today. The first point is to fundamentally change the conversation. The very first thing we did was create a document called The Power of Parking. And you can find that online, City of Kingston, The Power of Parking. You can also look at the hashtag that I use on Twitter, hashtag The Power of Parking, to find the document. And I encourage you to read it, because one observation that we certainly had is anytime most cities talk about parking, present company excluded, with some clever folks using clever communication techniques, most of the time when cities talk about parking, it's mind-numbingly boring. It makes you want to claw your eyes out. It's all planning documents, almost all planning documents are boring, but the parking documents are probably some of the most boring of them all. So we set out to write a document that fundamentally blew a hole through the conversation about parking. We started it with the first chapter being called The Real Parking Problem, because we wanted to break all the myths and mythologies about parking. We wanted to connect the dots with every single corporate goal and civic goal that the city of Kingston had, and how if you didn't fundamentally change and rethink your parking, you weren't going to achieve those goals. Full stop. No hesitancy in being that blunt. So I encourage you to read the document, because I think it's very hard to have a conversation about how to do different parking if you haven't changed the conversation about parking in your city, because you tend to go out and ask people what they think, and then you get kind of killed in those public meetings and such, if you haven't done a good job of really transforming and changing the conversation. So all sorts of dramatic ways to change that conversation. This is just a smattering of the media, the earned media that we specifically courted. The Commissioner of Planning and I were on podcasts. We did radio interviews. We did media interviews. We were out constantly talking about the real parking problem and how the answer is not more parking, but less and different, and how we were going to use it in the context of better transit, better bike infrastructure, better bike facilities and walking facilities, etc., to change the mode shift in the city, and change not only the use of cars, but the ownership of cars in our city. And to say it was successful is an understatement. We got a remarkable conversation started by leaning in on how hard that conversation normally is. We didn't sugarcoat anything that we were talking about. We put it about as bluntly as you possibly could. And we sort of courted the controversy, because the controversy around parking at least gets people's attention. So that's point one. How do you have a fundamentally different conversation about parking in your city? And how do you talk about the real parking problem and how it relates to all of your civic goals? I tended to use a phrase like this a lot. If you're If your priority is affordability, if it's climate emergency, if it's social equity or justice, you can't you care about those things without caring about doing parking in a fundamentally different way. It just doesn't work if you're not prepared to transform your parking. So I'm going to just pause there in a second. My second issue, my second point is address the elephant under the table right off the bat. One of the very first things we did was talk about the things that normally implode these kinds of conversations in cities. And they are usually accessible parking and on-street, and the effects it'll have on on-street parking. And we created our strategy for accessible parking in particularly right off the bat and telegraphed it right off the bat. We said, no matter what else we do in the context of less parking, we will not be reducing the minimum parking requirements for accessible parking, period, full stop. And a whole bunch of people who were ready to go to battle with us went, oh, and didn't, and became our allies through this process. Because in my observation, doing this all over the world, it is those issues that usually, and particularly accessible parking, that usually implode this whole community conversation. So why not just deal with it and solve it and address it right off the bat? And that was remarkably successful. The people who probably have been our most effective opponents became our first allies, really. The third...
And Brendan, at this moment, I'd like to just let you know that there's about a 2.5 minute warning.
Thanks. The third point is embrace the complexity before you decide what you're going to do. We went through all the various issues that other cities have debated. Do we remove our parking minimums, or do we just strategically reduce them and do other things? Do we create parking maximums, something that hasn't been discussed much yet? Which I actually believe is a more powerful tool than just the reduction of parking minimums. Do we create in the zoning at the same time incentives and regulations for bike parking, secured bike parking, larger bike parking, plugins for electric bikes, weather protected bike parking, secure bike parking to address issues of theft? So you address all these things in the bylaw at the same time as you're addressing the issue of vehicle parking. What we ended up doing was we didn't get rid of parking minimums for residential. We got rid of it for commercial. We got rid of them for industrial. We got rid of them for heritage projects. We got rid of them for affordable housing projects. For residential housing, we reduced them and we combined it with a cash in lieu incentive that would allow you to go deeper, where the cash in lieu, instead of being used for parking, was actually going to be used to start the first small city car share system, which is a key element to getting us from low car use to low car ownership. So we essentially looked for ways to do more than one thing through this strategic approach. And car share became something we were really interested in facilitating through this overall strategy. So you see my point. We did things that were specific to the details of the city that we were working in. The fourth point is learn from other cities, but choose your own local approach. As I said, we approached and learned from many, many other cities, but we quickly realized that they had resources, they had abilities, they had staff capacity that we didn't have in Kingston, and they weren't likely to get. And then the fifth point is do it quickly. They had wasted 5 years on big studies. We ended up doing this whole new approach in a year and a half. And what did we achieve? Well, our results were almost unanimous approach by council, no appeals at the Municipal Appeals Tribunal. And if you know anything about planning in Ontario, you know what a magic trick that was. No appeals at all. A made in Kingston approach, a sophisticated approach that didn't try to oversimplify the issue just for a good soundbite, a model of a way of doing many things. We're actually using the same approach on other issues now, including more housing diversity in the low density neighborhoods. And a model particularly for, as I say, lower, smaller and more historic cities of mid-size and small size, because we wanted Kingston to be an inspiration for those other cities. As John put it, a mighty city that punches above its weight and can become an inspiration for other cities that don't think they have the ability or the resources or the capacity to do something differently. And that has worked. I'll just end this way. This is Kingston has really become probably the most rock star small city in Canada when it comes to planning innovation. Maybe we're the Edmonton of small cities, Kim. but both national attention and international attention on our approach. My favorite line from Streets blog was steal this idea. But what I actually say is don't steal the idea, don't steal the answers, but we hope you will steal the way that we tackled the conversation, tackled the questions that we had answered and how we addressed those questions. Because if you replicate our approach, I think you can get your own answers in a way that's much more successful for you.
And I think that's and on that point, Brent, I really think that really applies here in Greater Victoria. We have a lot of small municipalities, and we can really wield great power despite the small sizes of cities like Victoria, like Colwood, like Langford. And so this really does give us the opportunity to think big and be bold, and not kind of waste more time with studies, as you say, and kind of just get to the action. And so I believe there are a number of city councilors from across the region currently on the call. If any would like to participate in our next section, which will be a community response panel with Julian West and Virginia Holden, please feel free to reach out to any of the representatives with a star next to their name. You can send us a personal message, and we'd be happy to spotlight you in this next section as well and have some stakes, some dialogue going as well. So at this time, though, I would like to introduce Julian West, a small-scale developer and social entrepreneur and founder of Urban Thrive, as well as Virginia Holden, the executive director of the Greater Victoria Housing Society.
Awesome. Kadonia, you want me to just jump in here then?
Yeah, just feel free to jump in.
Awesome, thank you. Loved what I was hearing, loved to hear about the progress and ideas that have been implemented at Emeryville, Edmonton, Kingston. I think it's really encouraging to hear these things actually happening and this conversation to be happening. And a lot of what I heard really resonated with me. The high cost of parking, we certainly in my business get into the weeds of that, and how taking what is that cost and sort of transitioning into that into other things that are of more value, the benefits that sort of flow out from there. I really like the emphasis on tying removing parking requirements to sustainable transportation alternatives that seem to be baked into everyone's conversation. And for me, it was I'm glad we got to car share at the end there, because I do think that's a really critical piece of the transition puzzle, right? So how do we go from where we're at today to where we want to be in maybe 30, 40 years from now? Car share is a really critical piece. And we're lucky here in the city of Victoria, we have two really high quality car shares that have very well established, 25-year history of that. I think that positions Victoria to be in a really good place. I could sort of talk for a long time, and I got a question to throw out there, but I'll let Virginia kind of jump in and provide some of her first impressions as well.
Thanks, Julian. As mentioned previously, I'm the executive director of the Greater Victoria Housing Society. We're a local nonprofit serving low to moderate income households, so families, seniors, persons with diverse abilities, working singles, and couples across the region. Currently, we just have just under 1,000 units under management, but we also are eager to develop and create more affordable housing across the region. So we also are an active developer, roughly have around 500 units under development. I thought it was a great conversation. I thought it was really interesting how you touched on different pieces of the conversation. I think going back to something Brent said, this is a complex issue. And, my background is as an urban planner. So, parking and trees, can be really heated topics in terms of helping communities achieve the goals that they want to achieve. I wanted to just follow up on kind of a thread that Brent kind of got into. If this is okay, time to kind of dive into questions. Yeah. Yes. Okay, good.
I think so.
So, as an affordable housing developer, parking is extremely expensive. I think that's got touched on a couple of times. I think, John, you talked about it in your initial piece. And the reality is, with a parking spot, especially underground, you're looking at $60,000 to $70,000 in our context. Costs go up. rents go up. And so especially if we're trying to achieve big community goals like affordability and equity, we're looking at climate action, public health, that's a big piece. I think that's a part of this parking equation. And, Brent, you did talk about how we communicate about parking. And I see that as just really key. It's key in the work that we do in terms of working with neighbors. We are trying to build housing that, the community needs, but also looking at, cost. So I guess the question is, and you touched on it a bit, and I think it's really key and crucial to this conversation, which is what are those key messages that cities and builders and planners need to talk to community about this important work?
Well, I don't know if others have comments. In my 30 years of doing this, there's in municipal politics, there's the P word and the D word. The P word is parking and the D word is density. And they're the two third rails of municipal politics, the two hardest things to have a conversation about without, getting stabbed. In my perspective and my experience, the cities that try to be too safe and cute or avoid the conversation at all, they pay a much bigger price. You can't get to where you need to be without bringing the community along with you and telling them the truth. And so if you look at our Power of Parking document, you'll see it's written very differently than any municipal document that I've seen before, quite on purpose. And it was meant to get the media interested, and then the media would get the public interested, and then they would read the document. That's the way you get it if you want everybody to be talking about this at their kitchen table. Because normal folks think of parking as a technical issue that is just an annoyance in their day. They don't connect the dots between that and the fact that they believe in climate change mitigation and they believe in housing choice, but they don't want you to change the parking. So if you're not willing to aggressively change that conversation, there's only so far you're ever going to get. That was our starting point of our entire 1.5 year long exercise, that honesty of that. And so when I talk to other cities, and so many cities, especially smaller cities, have been calling Kingston since we finished our work last year, that's our first message always. If you're not going to be bold enough to have that conversation, almost everything else we can teach you won't be as successful as it otherwise could be, or it might just go really badly.
Can I quickly jump in on the cost side of it? So we recently had a project approved by the District of Saanich, which paints a pretty clear picture. We had 9 homes approved without parking. If we had to provide parking, we'd be able to fit at most 5 homes. And what that means is on just land costs, if it was 5 homes, it would have been $175,000 per home on just land costs.
Yeah.
By going to 9 homes, we're able to reduce that $75,000 per home. So that's $75,000 of savings for each household. And that's just land costs. That doesn't include municipal fees. That doesn't include architectural fees. And you can spread out all of those things. It really is the key difference between whether you're building something that is attainable at all for middle income or low income family. And it's almost impossible to provide something with parking that's going to be reasonably attainable. A question I wanted to throw out here, because I heard little bits touched on this, is whether the role of local governments, what is the role of local governments in pushing for this change? Most developers in our region want to provide parking with what they sell. It's a bigger market to appeal to. But that might not align with our climate goals. That might not align with our road safety goals, our urban forest goals, which might suggest we should be looking more at parking maximums. So I would love to hear from our presenters, where do you find that balance between sort of leadership at the local level pushing these things to align with all those goals and objectives versus sort of letting the market dictate the appropriate level of parking?
I'll jump in to start here. Great question. I think for the city of Edmonton, our why certainly was grounded in our city plan, which is our municipal development plan I think that would be similar to an official community plan in British Columbia. And so, you know, really looking at how we can achieve that vibrant, walkable, compact, climate resilient, prosperous city. And so then from there, certainly it requires bold leadership from our city council, but we also looked at partnerships with our city building partners in the community and in the development industry. So when council was having conversations with communities, or we were out in the community talking about this, people were able to hear about the experiences that you would have as a developer, or the challenges that communities were having in terms of getting affordable housing in their community. It just wasn't happening. And so certainly feel that, you know, the importance of bringing all parties to the table, so to speak, to have the conversation about why are we doing this is really important for the success.
Yeah, and on that topic, Kim, since we do have some local city councilors in the room, I'm wondering, do you guys, City of Victoria, with Dave Thompson and Susan Kim, and Colby Harder with Langford, are you guys interested in taking action on parking within your respective municipalities?
Happy to chat about that. Yes, absolutely. Some of the people on this call will know that earlier this month, Victoria City Council did take action. Councillor Krista Loughton and I brought a motion at City Council to have parking minimums removed for most or all Victoria properties, and to support other options going forward: transit, car share, bike and mobility, scooter infrastructure, parking maximums, other transportation demand management measures. Staff are working on this right now and are going to give us a progress report at the end of February. So this passed at committee 6-3 and at council 7-2. And it followed many years of conversation around automobiles and alternative or other forms of transportation, which included parking. We did have some reductions in parking minimums in some properties a few years back. And then we had an election where sustainable transportation and the need for more space for housing were top topics. So like Edmonton, we will still be getting parking built, but hopefully not an oversupply that's mandated by the government. And like Edmonton, we have complementary ways of managing parking demand. We have time restricted, paid parking, resident only, etc. We're also going to be working on expanding accessible parking on streets and in other places. So, and you know, we'll adjust going forward as we need to. But I'd be really happy to hear from other council members from other cities and districts in the region. I know that there's several on the call. Would be very happy to chat with them if they desire about bringing motions in their municipalities.
Can I jump in and say the way that Dave just put it is really, really important, where he said we'll still have parking, just not mandated oversupply of parking. That's exactly how I put it to my clients, that if you're getting rid of your parking minimums or reducing them, you're still letting the market decide, and they may still oversupply. Certainly the commercial developers almost guaranteed they will for the foreseeable future. But what I say to my clients is you have to be certain, to a certain extent, zen about that. At least they're not doing it because you're forcing them to do the wrong thing. And the first goal is to not be the one who's causing the problem with your own rules. But then you can have the conversation about, do you want to intervene? And this was back to the Kadani's question. If you want to intervene in the marketplace, it probably is in the context of maximums, because the real parking problem, as we put it in Kingston, is that there's still an oversupply of parking being built, sometimes because of market choices, sometimes because of municipal rules. And if you're actually wanting to address that in specific locations in your city, then parking maximum should be part of the conversation. But my advice to every city of every type and every suburb of every type, because not every city is not every suburb is a city in the context of the kind of conversation we're having, is I get nervous when we immediately go to the conversation is, don't we want to be a cool kid like the rest of the cool kids and just get rid of our parking minimums? I think there's actually a very strategic conversation to be had city by city about, is the answer the same in your city as another city? Is your answer the same in every part of your city? Are there places in your city where it makes sense to get rid of the minimum and have a maximum, and other parts of your city where if you got rid of the minimum and developers didn't supply it, there may likely be on-street parking issues? So in Kingston, for example, we have 5 different zones from most urban to most suburban, and have a different parking approach and strategy in each one, because you've got to be pragmatic that not every part of your city is in the same place urbanistically. So what I say to cities is, embrace the complexity for the first while. Don't be paralyzed by it, but embrace the complexity. Think about the pros and cons of different strategies, how you can connect the dots to things like biking and car share, etc. And then come back and simplify it for your audience. But think about the opportunities. There's a bigger picture strategy in play here.
Yeah, and I think it's great that you brought that up. And I'd also like to open the floor to both Colby and Susan as well, because as you say, there are complexities, and Greater Victoria, each municipality has different needs. And so the needs of Langford will be different than the needs of Victoria. So I'm curious to hear from Colby as well, from Langford, which is planned a little bit differently than Victoria or Esquimalt, for example.
Yeah, thanks, Kadoni. There's been so many different pieces of this conversation that just really excite me. And for context, Langford has traditionally been known as a bedroom community to Greater Victoria. So there's large commuting patterns, pretty high car ownership, and previous mayor and council really touted providing free parking as an asset in the community. I think the biggest takeaway that I'm going to bring back to some of my colleagues is just the message around changing the culture through communications and bringing people alongside. I think that throughout the election and even now after, what I'm hearing from people is that they do want to see people getting around in different ways, and they want to be provided those options as well. And what we've been doing as a city just has been building more parking. I think one of the kind of lowest hanging fruit items that I heard from today was around car share. And we do have a pretty successful model in the city of Langford with modal car share. And this might be a question for Brent or Julian around how we can incentivize developers to include that as part of their project, and use that as a tool to reduce parking spaces. Oh, you're on mute, Brent.
Brent, you're muted.
Yeah, and actually before Brent jumps in here, I did see John's hand up as well. I wasn't.
John, would you like to go first?
Oh, no, please answer her question. I have a comment for something you said earlier. Go ahead.
Okay. It's interesting that you would say incentivize, because one of the key questions that we went over in Kingston and in many cities is, do you incentivize car share infrastructure or do you regulate it? And if so, where does the incentive come from? In Vancouver for decades, one of the reasons Vancouver is the most successful car share context in North America, by far, highest per capita ridership, car share, etc., is for decades, Vancouver never got rid of its parking minimums. It just had low parking minimums and allowed you to go lower and build even less if you built car share in your project. 5 spaces for every 1 car share space. Every single project in the city took advantage of that. So every single project in the city of Vancouver has car share, which to me is an example of, don't necessarily get rid of your parking minimums yet. Think about how you might be able to leverage them to achieve something else you want to achieve, like in Vancouver's case, car share. But in the more recent years, there's been the determination that you don't have to incentivize car share, you can actually regulate it. So what we did in Kingston is, we're not creating an incentive for car share, we created a regulation. Every project has to have car share in it right now, and we tested the legalities and concluded we could legally do that. But how will a car share system succeed in a city of Kingston's scale and nature? Maybe it might struggle, maybe it might fail. So we wanted a financial source to help it succeed, and thus we came up with, we're going to use the cash in lieu of parking, because we didn't completely get rid of the minimums, and use that to pay for the car share. That's the strategy right now.
Can I quickly build on that, Kadoni, real quick?
Oh, I would just like to say one thing just before.
Yeah,
I'm loving the
absolutely.
dialogue, loving the community response panel, but we've hit just after 1 o'clock, which was the cutoff time for our event. So I just wanted to let folks that maybe need to pop out, give them the chance to leave and be respectful of their time as well. We'll be able to continue this dialogue here until about, I'd say 1:15, maybe 1:20, if folks are really passionate and would like to stay on. So I just want to say thank you for everyone attending today. And if you'd like to stay up to date on any future events that we may be having, both virtually or in person, there are some links in the chat to our website and all of our social media accounts as well. So yeah, thank you so much. I think maybe some folks on our spotlight may need to run out as well. So just thanking them right now for giving us a little bit of their time in their very, very busy schedules.
Awesome.
And
Good night.
yeah, perfect. And maybe at about 1:05, so in about 2-3 minutes, we'll turn it over to some community questions from the audience as well.
Can I jump in here? Awesome. Just building off what Brent was saying about car share, I think there's a bit of a philosophical question around how hard you want to push, how much the municipality wants to lead the change versus sort of letting market sort of drive some of these transitions. I think that's a leadership question. I think that's a philosophical question. But incorporating car share into developments for reduced parking is well established in BC. It's well established in the city of Victoria. It would transition super easily over to Langford and pretty much any municipality that has like a minimum baseline density that would support it. But I would also echo the point that one of the most important things that municipalities can be doing is effectively walking people through this conversation. I have to stand in front of council and justify having car-free housing when they have goals that say we want an 80% reduction in emissions by 2050. We want lower car ownership. We want lower vehicle miles traveled. We want 80% of trips to be by cycling, walking, and transit. And then I have to like justify to the community and sort of get hate and stuff through that whole process and justify that over like a 2-year period. Like it's a weird position for me to be in. And municipalities haven't stepped into that space where they're owning that conversation. And I think that's one of the most important things municipalities can be doing, and really taking the time to do that in an authentic and deep and like very transparent way. And I'm seeing that like it's very rare to see, and I'm very excited to see that happening in Kingston, and we should be doing more of that here.
Amazing. And so are there any other responses? Susan has her hand up there.
I wanted to pass it to, I believe John had hand up first.
Susan, and if you'd like to say something, please go ahead. I've had the.
Thanks. I have to jump off shortly. So I think my intervention at this point would just be to say, kind of building off what Julian was saying, climate change is the existential threat we all know we're facing. And it's also kind of presents us the opportunity to build infrastructure and rethink social and physical space in a way that humans have never had the chance to before in history. Up until now, we have only ever inherited decisions and infrastructure. And now we have the opportunity to, as a culture, as a society, as a zeitgeist, we can have conversations like this. And I think that the number of folks we're seeing on this 1 hour plus 15 minutes conversation kind of speaks to that and the interest in that. And so I think our role here is to do things like do the comparative work of, okay, what does Langford have that Victoria doesn't, that Emeryville doesn't, or vice versa, so that we can do this in a smart way. I do believe in needing to intervene in doing something like a parking maximum perhaps, but we need to do it in a smart comparative way as well. That said, we're on the precipice of needing this, right? Climate change is the big thing we're all facing down the barrel of. And so I'm excited. And a recent example of that is a proposal that came forward to Victoria Council, and there was nothing about EV bike or cargo bike infrastructure, but it was willing to remove parking. Cool. So we successfully created that amendment where we needed to, we asked the individual to create that infrastructure, because if you end up being a family renting a unit on this property, how are you actually going to bike your groceries home while carrying a kid on just like a simple two-wheeler? There's some very physical and practical things that we need to think about for families, for folks with accessibility needs. And that's our role, knowing that it is a part of the bigger climate conversation. So thank you to Julian for kind of kicking off that lens, and I'll pass it to Virginia from here, and thank you all for having me.
You're muted, Virginia.
Yeah,
Can't hear you.
There, Virginia.
Good grief, after 2 years, you think you'd figure it out. I think John had a comment before me, and then I did have a question, but I'm not sure if we have enough time for it. Oh no, I think
John may
Can I pick up on something that Brent?
Oh, here he goes.
Am I frozen still?
Oh, you're cutting in and out.
Like that? Oh.
Give
Can
it a
you hear
try,
me
John.
now?
We can hear you. You're frozen, but we can hear you. Oh, maybe not.
Okay, maybe we'll just go to Virginia for now while John works through some tech issues.
Yeah, thanks. I just had one, if we have time for one question, and I think it has been commented on actually all the presentations so far, which is just around, you know, the impact to equity deserving populations. So Councillor Kim kind of talked about, different abilities. Brent, you also talked about, getting the elephant out of under the table, just name it right away. And of course, as a nonprofit housing provider, I'm serving a lot of people that are equity deserving populations. So, given the importance of some of these community issues, how do we consider those lenses, those perspectives, and who do we need, as cities do need to bring on really early as part of this conversation?
I'm going to jump in and then mic drop my way out of here to my next meeting. But I think a group that is often overlooked are those who are not seen as the electorate. And so these are permanent residents. These are immigrant and refugee families, those who have different ideas of what families look like, especially in Victoria. We also have to keep in mind that families like that also take on a different nature of labor and work in our communities, and what do those needs require. And so if they can indeed afford to live in Victoria, do they need a car to make it up the peninsula to some of the more rural agricultural work, or into the industrial areas outside of the city limits? And having to consider those dynamics. And then the challenge there is also, how do we reach these members of our community? Because we have to expect that they're able to connect with folks like the Intercultural Association of Victoria. A really messed up anecdote I'll share is that when we were receiving the influx of refugees from Ukraine, there was no federal government list of folks who were coming over. There were literally volunteers who set up a table at Vancouver Airport trying to intercept people as they came off the planes to then get them connected into local resources. And that is just an example of a gap that we are having to then try to overcome to make sure that the municipal resources that folks will be accessing are adequate. So that's just one example of a challenge that I would highlight. And yeah, thank you so much for this question, Virginia. I'll pass it on from here, and thanks everyone.
Yeah, I'd also like to mention that Karen Harper has also joined in on our community spotlight here. So Karen, I was under, you had said that you wanted to share some thoughts on priorities and practice from council. Oh, you are muted.
I just unmuted myself twice, but anyhow, I do know how to unmute. I just wanted to say, first of all, thank you to everyone. And and of course, as you know, I don't speak for all of council. None of us speak for all of our councils. However, having said that, I can share that I share some of the same frustrations that have been articulated here today. And at least in this region, because of the timing of the election, I think most of us are in the process of doing strategic planning. And so I think that this type of session is extremely helpful to those of us who want to move forward in these areas. I'm sort of famous for saying things like, if I never see this again, it's too soon. And so that's sort of where I'm coming from, but this has been extraordinarily helpful. And I do think that particularly the comment that Brent made about zoning by area, because Saanich, for example, is a huge municipality, geographically speaking, with very urban, but also very rural and everything in between. And I think that's something I really want to take a look at as we move forward, because that could be a really way to quick start it, because I think that would be helpful. And I can only say so much given that I'm only one of many.
Amazing. And so at this time, now that we're slowly running out of time in our afternoon, I just wanted to get to some of the community questions that were posed in the chat. One of the first ones that came in was from Robin, who had said, how are the needs of people with disabilities being taken into account? TDM typically do not provide options for those with mobility impairments. Example, rideshare stalls that are not accessible. So throwing that out to our response panel, if anyone has anything they'd like to add there.
Well, I think I've answered that from the Kingston perspective. I think different cities have done it differently, but I just say, you know, people like Virginia understand the needs of the ability and disability needs and challenges of their residents better than anybody at City Hall does. So it was, although we had the conversation about do we get rid of minimums altogether or just for some categories, getting rid of them for affordable housing was a no-brainer. Obviously, we get rid of and let the affordable housing providers, who are specialists in many cases around certain groups and subgroups who need that kind of housing, let them decide and let them plan accordingly in the context of their building form. So it's like rather than let the market decide, it's let the nonprofit decide in this context.
And I could add some local context here. It was definitely not part of the conversation even in the very recent past, but that's changing quickly. The city of Victoria has put on like a pretty strong accessibility lens. Just in September, they have put some pretty clear requirements and guidelines on accessible parking in new developments. It's baked right into our recent missing middle policy. And I'm seeing other municipalities go that direction as well. Saanich is having the same kind of conversation. So I think that's very much becoming central to this type of conversation. And Brent called it out earlier, right? It needs to be one of those planks that you address on the front and have it baked sort of throughout. And as an example, the city of Paris, they're cutting their parking across the city by half, but they're actually increasing the number of accessible parking stalls, which is brilliant, right? Like we want to get people to not use vehicles frivolously, but we want to have vehicles available for those who actually really need it. And having a disability is an appropriate use for a vehicle, right? So we want to incentivize and encourage the right type of behaviors. And Victoria is already going that direction. I expect our region will sort of pick up after their lead, and that will become baked into standard policy fairly soon.
I'll just add, in the city of Edmonton, we have an accessory advisory committee that we worked really closely with, and they're an advisory group that deals with all aspects of city building. And so that's how we sort of establish what would be most appropriate to include regulations in the bylaw to ensure that those accessible stalls were still provided.
Amazing. Those were all really, really great responses to that question there. We had another question as well in the chat earlier on from Jim and Irene. Their question was asking about if anyone is seeing issues with lenders requiring parking to get construction loans, as they say this was an issue in Rochester, New York, which eliminated downtown parking minimums decades ago. So are we seeing any issues with lenders and construction loans?
I haven't run into it yet myself, but I imagine it is actually an issue to just get underwrite a loan. We work quite closely with Van City Credit Union, which is very sort of progressive on these kind of things. They have a close relationship to Moto Car Share. They've committed to net zero investing, I think by 2040. So they're quite progressive in thinking about these things. So if a standard lender isn't providing the financing, you might have to seek out someone who is ahead of the curve on this. And I think it'll become standard practice at some point in time, but during this sort of early phase of these kind of policies, you might have to seek out a lender that's going to back you on it.
And
in my experience, it depends on the city. There's so many cities that are in different places in the learning curve and the reality curve of other alternatives to car use, right? If you're already a city that is well established with bus, bike, walking, car share, etc., your lenders probably to a certain extent understand that. I say to a certain extent because there's some stupid lenders out there. But I think where your city is on that learning curve. But this is why when I tell cities that they can get rid of their parking minimum, even if their city isn't there yet on the other curve, one of the reasons I say they can do that is because your builders are still going to build parking, because their lenders or just their own sense of the market is going to tell them that the city isn't ready for people to not own cars because the walking, biking, transit infrastructure isn't there yet. But they can make that choice now, and it's certainly better than being mandated to overbuild. So the system, the first thing you have to tell the community is getting rid of parking minimums doesn't mean less parking. I think, Kim, you said that. It just means, and David said that, it just means the city isn't over mandating. To a certain extent, more rational decision-making will occur than went into the establishment of the minimum parking standard in the zoning bylaw in the first place.
Yeah. And with that, I think Virginia maybe had something to add there.
No, I think it's covered. I think all meant to say is, for us, our major lenders are, folks like Van City and, BC Housing and CMHC, who are also have these other goals around communities, around carbon reduction and livability and being close to amenities and transit. So for us, from a lending perspective, we're not impacted in that way so far.
And just to close things off, as we are reaching the end of our discussion period as well, we had one question, which is putting the power back into the people, asking what would be the first steps you'd recommend to take in changing the parking conversation in your city if you're not part of council or city staff? How can the everyday person get involved in the discussion?
I'll just pitch out an idea. I think that social media really has changed the game. There are so many visual ways that you can explain what you want to say through video, through pictures. And I think that sometimes seeing C's worth of parking and questioning, is this really how we want to use land space, can open up the conversation to people who might not be excited by parking at first, but are excited about climate action or affordability. So really just kind of linking it to people in a way that they care, I think is the most important first step.
Two things come to my mind. One is just like kitchen table conversations. And this is about culture change ultimately, right? Like Brent talked about it earlier, right? There isn't an irrational justification for this. It's really not. It's all about culture. It's about values, and we're in a transition period right now. And the more we have these conversations, especially at that sort of kitchen table level, the better. And one of the most powerful ways that we've found to communicate our message is showing and bringing to light car-free families that want to live in our homes, and just making it real, right? And it's like, showing seniors and people with young kids and people with teenagers and getting them to talk about their lifestyle and making it feel real. So if you do live that lifestyle already, or a very car light lifestyle, like getting that out into the world through social media, talking to your neighbors about it, like that's the stuff that makes it feel real. And it's a lot of the resistance comes from people who have just never experienced that lifestyle before and do absolutely everything with a vehicle, and it feels totally alien to them. The more we can make it feel not alien and more just normal, even if it's not for them, but it's just recognizing that it's a lifestyle choice people have, the more, you know, I think this change will happen quickly and I think smoother over time.
Perfect. Those are great, lovely words. And I hope that we'll be able, everyone still in this room will be able to take those words with them today and really make an impact in their own communities as well. I want to thank everyone that was here speaking on the call today for giving us some of your time and sharing your wisdom and expertise on this subject. And I also want to thank everyone that's here in the audience today for, again, taking time out of your own day to come and sit and chat with a bunch of people on the internet about parking. It might not sound cool when you talk to other people about it, but I assure you, you guys are really, really cool for being here. And this is a really awesome and important subject that we need to be having within our cities, both for housing affordability and for climate action. So I just want to say thank you again. And if you want to keep up to date on this event and get a webinar recording as well, if there's something that maybe you wanted to revisit, we'll be posting that on the Community Social Planning Council website as well and across our socials. So I hope everyone has a great rest of their day and afternoon, and I hope to see you all again at the next event that we put on.
Kedonia, thanks so much for hosting. Great conversation. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, thanks.